Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Zoe, a member of the ICCT Communications team. Thank you for attending today's webinar. The webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording to all participants sometime next week. Everyone has their microphones on mute. If you have any questions, you can write them in the questions block in the control panel to the right of your screen. After the introduction and presentation that will last about 20 minutes, we will have an additional 20 minutes to answer questions from the audience. Today, we are going to talk about fuels and Fit for 55, identifying sustainability risks and opportunities to increase greenhouse gas savings presented by Chelsea Baldino. Chelsea is a researcher on the ICCT's field team.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm going to turn my camera off, but before I dive into the webinar, I'd like to quickly explain who we are. The International Council on Clean Transportation is a nonprofit independent research organization with the mission of reducing greenhouse gas and health impacts of the transportation sector. We achieve this by providing technical analyses to policymakers and other interested stakeholders. I'll first go over the key renewable fuel policies and the overall Fit for 55 package that the European Commission released this summer. And then I'll describe a modeling study that we contracted to assess these policies and possible changes to them. I'll then show our key results, including greenhouse gas savings and average cost of carbon abatement in the different policy scenarios, as well as how renewable fuel and electricity consumption is incentivized in each. Then the most important part, the implications for the trilogue. What changes can be made to the proposed policies to increase greenhouse gas savings and lower the cost of carbon abatement? So the Renewable Energy Directive was revised as a part of the Fit for 55 legislative package. The current policy includes a 14% renewable energy target for road and rail in 2030, with the option for aviation and marine sectors to opt in. But now the Commission has proposed to amend the RED II and replace their energy target with a 13% greenhouse gas intensity reduction target that covers all sectors. This change increases the ambition level of the transport target in the RED II, and it fundamentally changes how the policy will function. Current RED II, all fuels are required to meet a greenhouse gas reduction threshold relative to fossil fuels to be considered eligible. For example, all biofuels must meet 50 to 65% reduction. However, once they meet this threshold, all fuels are considered equal on an energy basis when contributing to the 14% energy target, except in the case they receive a multiplier. And in the current RED II, there are multipliers for Annex 9 fuels. These are mainly waste and residues, electricity, and fuels used in the maritime or aviation sectors. Under the proposed revision, the greenhouse gas reduction remains this requirement, the threshold. Now, all fuels that achieve higher greenhouse gas savings would make a larger contribution towards the policy target, so these pathways are more highly incentivized. So what this proposed change to a greenhouse gas reduction target means is that even though the proposed target is nominally lower, 13% is lower than 14%, its ambition actually is much higher. You need a greater amount of renewable fuel to achieve a 1% greenhouse gas reduction compared to 1% of energy. The new proposal is also more ambitious because it removes all the multipliers I just mentioned, except for the multiplier going to fuels to the marine and aviation sectors. So there's two other pieces of legislation. The RED is a directive, so that means it's up to the member states to implement. But there's also two new proposed regulations for aviation and marine. These are separate and legally binding and would be implemented at the EU level. So for aviation, this includes a sustainable aviation fuel SAF mandate for several years going all the way to 2050, including a 5% SAF mandate in 2030. There's a sub-mandate as a part of the 5% that's 0.7% for renewable fuels of non-biological origin, also called ReFuelEU. This includes e-fuels. It's important to note that the Commission excluded food-based biofuels from counting towards the SAF mandate, which will help support more advanced sustainable fuels than we've historically seen produced for the road sector. There's also a FuelEU maritime regulation that includes a greenhouse gas intensity reduction requirement, also going out to 2050, including a 6% reduction target for 2030. In this regulation, lower carbon fossil fuels, such as some applications of liquefied natural gas, would qualify, but they also have excluded food and feed-based fuels. So now onto our modeling. We hired a consultant to assess the impacts of the revisions to the RED II and aviation regulation. We did not assess the maritime sector. This study by Adam Christensen is on our website, and I've summarized it as well in a briefing paper also on our website. It assesses what the mix of fuels in the road and aviation sector will be under these two policies in 2030, and what the associated costs and greenhouse gas savings will be. Adam used a partial equilibrium model to simulate decisions made by fuel blenders and suppliers, as well as vehicle consumers who are complying with either this greenhouse gas intensity reduction or a renewable energy target. The fuel suppliers trade and use greenhouse gas reduction credits from the use of the fuels or electricity to achieve compliance with the targets. So here are all the scenarios we assessed. I realize this is a lot to try to take in, so you don't really need to, but I will explain to you the overall themes that we were trying to assess the impact of. And of course, if you have any questions, you can let us know. We wanted to compare several policy scenarios looking at the proposals as they are. That's scenario 1, as well as possible changes. So these scenarios assess the impact of the overall transport target being either a greenhouse gas reduction target compared to a renewable energy target. What happens when you reduce the greenhouse gas intensity target? That's the lower greenhouse gas intensity target scenario, the second one. What happens if you remove the eligibility of food and feed-based fuels counting towards the target, including intermediate crops, which I'll explain more in a minute? What happens when you change the volume of the renewable energy target? So you can see towards the bottom there, we have a high renewable energy target scenario. We wanted to look at the impact of changing the advanced biofuel target level and a ReFuelEU target for aviation. That's our higher sub-target scenario. To explain, the RED II revision proposal increases the advanced biofuel mandate from 1.75% as it is in the current RED, when you consider double counting, to 2.2% of transport energy. In addition, the RED II revision includes a new 2.6% energy mandate for ReFuelEUs. We included that, but we did not assess any changes to that. We also assessed what would happen if member states achieved lower electric vehicle penetration than planned. That's the low EV growth scenario. And unless otherwise noted, all current definitions in the RED, including phase outs as well and caps, apply here in this model. In the renewable energy target scenarios, the model applies multipliers as they are currently in the RED, while the greenhouse gas intensity target only maintains the 1.2 times multiplier for aviation and marine, which aligns with the RED II revision proposal. And actually, now that I say this, the 1.2 multiplier here would only matter for aviation, since we didn't include the marine sector in our modeling, but it's in the regulation or in the directive. So now some of our results. So total greenhouse gas savings are shown here in the teal bars, as well as the average carbon cost, carbon abatement cost in euros per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. Those are the triangles on a different axis. So the average cost of carbon abatement is calculated as the difference in consumer costs when compared to a baseline where there is no renewable fuel policy, divided by greenhouse gas savings. The first finding is that lower costs of carbon abatement are achieved when you have a greenhouse gas target compared to an energy target. The energy targets are shown second and third from the right, and you can see that they have barely any greenhouse gas savings, if any at all, and accordingly a high cost of carbon abatement. This is because a greenhouse gas intensity target can provide an incentive to further decarbonize fuel production beyond the greenhouse gas reduction requirement, that threshold. because it rewards additional efficiency and production improvements for different pathways. In the middle, we see the higher sub-targets scenario. You can see there that greenhouse gas savings actually can increase with a higher sub-targets, higher sub-mandate. There's a lower cost carbon abatement relative to the proposal. At the same time, though, it's very important to note that introducing overall higher ambition for the transport sector in the RED II revision does not result in genuinely higher greenhouse gas savings. In particular, if you look at the first bar, that's the proposal as is, and the no food-based fuels scenario, the third one, even though this scenario has a lower target, you achieve more greenhouse gas savings at a lower cost of carbon abatement. This is because the RED II does not include indirect land use change, ILUC, in the calculation of the greenhouse gas intensity of the different pathways. At the same time, food-based biofuels are some of the lowest cost alternative fuels available. So there's an incentive to use these fuels to meet the target, although in reality, they may provide very little climate mitigation, and in some cases, they're worse than fossil fuels. So in the modeling, we follow the RED greenhouse gas intensity calculation for the fuel pathways when modeling compliance. That is, we do not include ILUC, but we do include ILUC here when showing the real greenhouse gas savings. So the fact that we included ILUC explains why the average carbon abatement cost drops and greenhouse gas savings increases when food and feed-based biofuels are excluded, for example, in that third bar, to help meet the amended RED II mandate. Similarly, we achieve the highest greenhouse gas savings and lowest carbon abatement cost of any scenario in scenario 4, where no food-based or intermediate crops are allowed. So I've mentioned crops a couple times. You might be confused why this is important, but it's very important. So I'll try to break it down pretty well. So intermediate crops are planted before or after the main crop. They can include winter corn, and they are not under the food and feed-based biofuel cap in the RED II. Specifically, I've written out exactly where they're defined in Article 2, paragraph 40. They are starch-rich crops, sugar crops, or oil crops produced on agricultural land as the main crop, but excluding residues, waste, or lignocellulosic material, and intermediate crops, such as catch crops and cover crops. But this is provided that the use of such intermediate crops does not trigger demand for additional land. In Europe, intermediate crops are grown for environmental reasons, such as erosion protection or prevention. But globally, most intermediate crops are cash crops, grown purely for economic reasons. This is particularly true in warm climates where it's possible to have multiple growing seasons in a year. When they're grown as cash crops, they are associated with the same ILUC as fuels. There's currently no guidance on how to certify intermediate crops, and we aren't sure how voluntary schemes would interpret the clause saying that they should not cause additional demand for land, as well as how they would certify that a crop is not the main crop. So in our analysis, we simply assume that member states in voluntary schemes would not attempt to factor in this land demand and would simply count all intermediate crops as eligible. We realize that we don't know for sure that this would happen, but we think that this analysis highlights the importance of intermediate crops in the RED. So here I'm showing different kinds of fuels as well as electricity that would be used in policy scenario in billion diesel liter equivalent. Increasing the overall target mainly results in the production of more intermediate crop biofuels, the red bars there. And these are associated, as I said, with significant land use change. So for example, on the right, you see in the renewable energy target scenario that higher targets means a doubling of intermediate crops. And in the previous figure, we saw there was lower greenhouse gas savings compared to a lower target. So increased ILUC from these additional intermediate crops dilutes the greenhouse gas savings. And similarly, in a low EV growth scenario, if member states aren't meeting their electric vehicle deployment ambition, that intermediate crops will fill some of the space to help meet the target. You can see that there's much more intermediate crops there compared to the revision proposal as is on the far left. So the reasons for the high contribution of intermediate crops to the fuel mix in these scenarios is because using these crops to produce fuels is one of the least expensive pathways for complying with the overall targets, and they're not subject to a cap. So basically, once the food-based and waste-based biofuel caps are filled, the sub-mandates are met, and the demand for renewable electricity in vehicles is counted, we find that any remaining demand for renewable fuel to meet the overall transport target is met by intermediate crops. And as you can see in the second scenario, the lower greenhouse gas target, if we reduce the overall transport target to a level that's close to the sum of the sub-mandates and capped feedstocks, plus expected renewable electricity, we're minimizing the demand for intermediate crop biofuel. And I'd also like to add, you can see I made a note there alongside intermediate crops about PFAS and edible animal fats, that we're also concerned about these two feedstocks because they're associated with high emissions. We did not include them in our model, but we expect that they would have a similar effect as with intermediate crops. Palm fatty acid distillate, PFADs, are a byproduct of palm oil refining, and edible animal fats. And there's animal fats. So like intermediate crops, we expect that they would be used to meet the target once sub-mandates have been met. And let me explain a little bit more about those. So both of these feedstocks are relatively cheap and therefore would be used to meet the targets, and they're not capped. The problem is that both of these feedstocks have current uses, so displacing them will lead to indirect emissions. For example, they're used in soap or animal feed, and when they're diverted from these uses to use in biofuel, this means they could be replaced with palm oil. You can see on the right in the figure that this has a drastic effect on the life cycle emission of fuels produced from these feedstocks. In the case of PFADs in particular, it means that the fuel is much worse than fossil fuels, which we show here with the red line. So to sum up, I'd like to include some key recommendations for the trilogue. We suggest excluding all food and feed-based feedstocks, including intermediate crops, and lowering the greenhouse gas reduction target accordingly. The no food or feed or intermediate crop scenario in our modeling achieved the highest greenhouse gas savings at the lowest cost of carbon abatement. If that's not possible, we suggest excluding intermediate crops from the RED II proposal because that would deliver even greater greenhouse gas savings than removing food-based biofuels alone. Similarly, we suggest limiting or excluding PFADs and edible animal fats. If both of these are not political possibilities, then we suggest just generally lowering the greenhouse gas intensity target. This would reduce the incentive for intermediate crops, PFADs, and edible animal fats. We also suggest keeping the greenhouse gas intensity target instead of the renewable energy mandate as it is in the red. And we also want to emphasize that if member states don't achieve their electric vehicle deployment, unsustainable feedstocks might be used to meet the target. So it's important to support national efforts to deploy electric vehicles. And then finally, a lot of this presentation is focusing on what to exclude. We would like to also emphasize that the advanced biofuel submandate could be increased at little cost, and this would also increase greenhouse gas savings. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Chelsea, for that great presentation. Now we will move to the Q&A section of the webinar. I would also like to introduce Stephanie Cyril, Director of the ICCT Fuels team, who will help field questions. Remember, if you have questions, write them in the questions box in the control panel, and we will answer as many as we can. I think we had one come in during the presentation. So we'll start with, what implications does your study have for the ReFuelEU Maritime?
Thanks, that's a good question. So yeah, as I mentioned, we did not include the maritime sector in our modeling, but we have similar sustainability concerns for that sector as I emphasized here. So intermediate crops would also be able to qualify towards that greenhouse gas reduction requirement, as well as PFADs and inedible animal fats. So there's some similar policy implications there as well.
Great. Another question here is, What greenhouse gas emissions did you assign to renewable fuels of non-biological origin, such as e-fuels in the model?
So we assigned a greenhouse gas intensity of 0 to these fuels. This is a really important consideration because that means that we assumed only zero carbon electricity was used to produce those fuels and that they are truly additional. So this is a key term because right now we're actually waiting on a delegated act to come from the European Commission defining what additionality is. So basically the additional renewable electricity was used to produce these fuels. Depending on the strength of that delegated act, that will definitely impact the carbon intensity of the pathway. So here we assumed an ideal situation that the additionality requirement is very robust.
Great, thank you. One more question here. Did you include fossil-derived hydrogen called blue hydrogen in the model?
Sorry, I had an issue with my microphone for a second. We did not include fossil-derived hydrogen. This aligns with the RED as it is, as well as the RED 2 revision proposal. I feel like there was something else I was going to say about this. Stephanie, do you want to chime in?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
If we included fossil-based hydrogen in the modeling. I said no.
Yes. It was included in the model as an option that fuel suppliers could use. However, it was not counted as eligible towards any of the targets because the current proposed RED 2 revision does not include any fossil-derived hydrogen as an eligible pathway, and we did not include that option in any of our scenarios. However, we expect that if it were added to the RED 2 during the trialogue, that it would become an economically favorable pathway compared to green hydrogen and could have a significant impact.
Another question here. Which GHG reduction target do you recommend?
So this really depends on what would happen with, like, if policymakers were able to take our recommendations about food-based biofuels as well as intermediate crops, PFAS, and edible animal fats. So as is, we actually, if you lower the greenhouse gas target to, I think, around 9%, it actually achieves more greenhouse gas savings. But that's because right now intermediate crops are allowed. So if you remove those, then you could keep the 13% as it is. So it depends on how you allow these other feedstocks. If you can't remove them or cap them in any way, then we actually would recommend lowering the target. But if you can, keeping 13% would be fine.
Great. I think this next question is for Stephanie. Do you consider PFAD to be a residue or a co-product? And do you consider it to be a food and feed crop according to the RED 2, as it is not particularly stated otherwise in the RED 2?
So great question. PFADs is a very important topic because it can easily be turned into biofuel, and there's great supply globally of this material. So we consider it to be a residue or a byproduct is another term that you could use because it represents a relatively small share of the overall economic output of the palm oil production process. Another way to say that is that for 1 kilogram of palm oil that is refined, you get a relatively small share of PFADs from that, even though it has about the same price as palm oil. And so we don't expect increased demand for PFADs to drive increased production of palm oil directly. No one is going to be growing more palm trees so that they can get more PFADs because PFADs is such a small share of the output. However, it still has very important sustainability considerations because it is completely, like Chelsea said, completely used within livestock feed and oleochemicals such as soap making. And if we divert it towards biofuel production, it will be replaced very likely with palm oil. So it will drive its use in biofuel will drive an indirect increase in palm oil production. And so that displacement effect is something that we consider very important to take into account. As for how it counts towards the RED II, I think it's clear that it does not count as a food and feed crop because it is a residue or byproduct of palm oil production. And I believe it was proposed to be added to a positive list of residues in a recent commission proposed delegated regulation that was released over the summer. So according to that proposal, PFAS would be counted as a residue with no upstream emissions allocated. And in the RED II, there's no displacement emissions allocated either. So because of this, PFAS could be a very favorable pathway with no upstream emissions or displacement emissions counted. It would have a relatively low carbon intensity, so it would be very favorable towards the greenhouse gas target in the RED II. And that's why we think it is such a big sustainability concern.
One more question here. Could you briefly highlight what is the benefit of using a partial equilibrium economic model for this rather than just making some reasonable assumptions about the hierarchy of usage for different feedstocks? Does it make the results significantly more robust?
So I think this is a question for our modeler who actually did the work for this modeling study. And we have him on the line here. His name is Adam Christensen, and he is at GAMS. Adam, if you're able to unmute yourself, could you please answer the question?
Hi there, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon in Europe. So thanks for the question. I think some reasonable assumptions will get you pretty far, but to really include a lot of the different dynamics of consumer behavior, blending behavior, and the actual economic impact and how all those feedbacks kind of loop around each other. Really the only framework that you can kind of reliably count on is something like a partial equilibrium model. So yeah, we include things like vehicle switching, blending behavior for the blender, the actual economic feedback from the price of the greenhouse gas credits that are being traded in a market to demonstrate compliance. And so, yeah, all that wrapped up in one framework kind of gives a consistent set of rules in order to judge these policies. So.
Okay, it looks like we have answered all of the questions. Thank you everyone for participating in today's presentation, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions. Remember to follow us at the ICCT. Thanks again, and we hope to see you soon.